You're watching FJTN, the Federal Judicial Television Network.
Be cautious. Never assume that everything is okay. This is not a job for predisposed attitudes about people or about the job.
And it's the unknown. I think that adds the stress.
If safety's important to you, it's not going to happen on its own.
How we carry ourselves is the key to our safety and achieving our goals.
Focus is probably the most important part of personal safety.
Our goal should be to help the defendant and to go home safely at the end of the day.
Someone once said that your best tool or defensive tactic is your mouth and your mind.
I was kind of doing what I call speed home visits. We were kind of stressed, needed to try to get as many home visits in a day as I could. And I don't remember the number, but I was probably trying to get around 8 to 10 done. And I went into a bad area, and I was really kind of focusing on getting the rest of the home visits completed, not really thinking about completing this one home visit. So I drove into an area that I didn't realize was fenced in. So I pulled in, went to the front door, there was no one home. As I walked back to my car, a car pulled in behind me, which I didn't notice driving in was my only way out. And loud music, and these guys that were in the car were not gentlemen that were on their way to work or looked like they had anything to do other than check me out. So I noticed that's when I focused on safety at that time. The music's going, they're just sitting there staring at me, not budging. So I just kind of looked at them, and I bent into my car, opened my briefcase, hoping that they thought that I had something more in my briefcase than my standard issue peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which is all I had at that time, because we didn't have firearms. Fortunately, they hung out for a little bit, I guess checked me out, and drove away. But I realized then that I need to be a little more focused on doing that home visit before I pull in somewhere in my vehicle, knowing that there is a way out, as opposed to just pulling in, going up to the door, knocking on the door, and not being aware of my surroundings.
Live from the Federal Judiciary's studios in Washington, D.C., the Federal Judicial Center presents Personal Mindset, the Internal Threat to Officer Safety. Moderating today's program, Mark Maggio.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As you saw in the lead-in to today's broadcast, this is the Federal Judicial Center's new safety series. On top of all the other safety training that we've done over the years, we're now launching a new safety initiative in what we're calling our safety series. Today's broadcast is the maiden voyage of that safety series. We've got a couple of other broadcasts planned for this fiscal year, one in next May and one in September. And plans for that program, both of those programs, are coming about as we speak. So as we develop these, we're looking for topics, the critical issues that you feel are important. So please don't hesitate to call me at the Federal Judicial Center or my colleague Bill Timish, and let us know about the topics that you think are important that we can incorporate into this entire safety series presentation, things that you think are critical that you really want to hear about. And speaking of topics, brings us to today's topic, which is personal mindset, the internal threat to officer safety. We began this journey about 6 months ago, June of this year, with an advisory committee that we put together, and almost to a person, those folks told us, this is where you need to start. You need to look at mindset. Before you've got weapons, like before you have the guns and the capstone, before vests and handcuffs, they said, you have mindset. Mindset is peppered throughout the use of force continuum. At every level of the use of force continuum, you have to be focused and you have to train with regards to mindset. So they told us this is where you start. And we jumped on the bandwagon and agreed, and 6 months later, here we are. So before I turn to our panelists to begin a discussion on the story that you just saw from David Martin, I want to highlight a couple more things for you. We have some push-to-talk sites on board today. We're going to encourage them to jump in at any time during the broadcast as the Spirit moves to ask questions of our panelists. We're also going to encourage the rest of you who are view-only sites. We have a fax number that's appearing on the lower screen to fax questions into us at any time during the broadcast as well, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Let me emphasize to keep your questions on the faxes as brief and to the point as possible. That allows us to get as many questions in during the broadcast as we can. So as I go to the panelists for our first discussion, let me quickly mention the story that you saw from Pretrial Services Officer David Martin in Florida Middle, as well as acknowledging the interviewed officers you'll see throughout the broadcast. These folks gave it their time and talent to come in here and be interviewed by us. We had a series of questions we prepared, and we want to thank all of them up front for contributing to this program. David, you probably didn't know, my friend, that yours was going to be the lead-in story per se for the broadcast, but I want to publicly acknowledge what I think you shared was a very important story for us. It gave us a great teaching place to begin our discussion. I think it showed a lot of integrity and honesty on your part to share a story that you obviously took some lessons learned away from, and shows your commitment to safety as well and to the system. So, my friend, thank you so much for giving us that first story. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists, Debbie Wojciechowski and George Santa Cruz. Debbie is a U.S. probation officer from the District of Maryland, and George is a U.S. probation officer from the District of Massachusetts. Both are safety instructors, both are defensive tactic instructors. So let's jump into just a couple of quick comments about David's story. And George, let me start with you. If you had that scenario to work with in a training setting, what would be the teaching points you'd focus on?
Mark, the thing that jumps out at me is that David recovered really quickly from a bad situation. His mind was elsewhere when he was out on the road. He was thinking about the contacts that he had yet to make, not the one he was making at the time. The reality is that life's coming at you 1,000 miles a minute, no matter where you're at, no matter where your head's at, no matter what personal or professional issues are going on with you. It's coming at you fast. And if you're not able to look far enough ahead, you're going to get jammed up. And then you have a crisis situation to which you have to react at the last minute, which he had, and he reacted well. You know, in driving lingo, it was a quick stop. It was an emergency swerve, and he executed fine. But what I see in that scenario is that if you look far enough ahead, you can prevent yourself from being in that crisis moment.
Okay. Debbie, how about you? Teaching points, if you were putting this training program together and you had that scenario to work with, where would you focus?
Mark, I think if we're honest with ourselves as officers, that any one of us could find ourselves in that situation. We're very task-oriented. We're preoccupied. We want to get so many home visits done in one day. There's things that we have in our mind. Perhaps we're thinking about where we were before or where we're going afterwards. Personal problems that we have to do in the office, and we can very easily become preoccupied. Another teaching point was that apparently he had no crisis rehearsal. He had not made a what-if as we do in applied officer safety, and a good mindset should always leave you a way out. However, to his credit, he was able to re-evaluate the situation and readjust very quickly. So yes, there was a plan. He was able to go into plan A, although it wasn't there previously, and to start focusing.
Yeah, I think with the way David characterized it, and again, I just have the greatest respect for his ability to share that type of story with us. I think he emphasizes the fact that whether you've got the right mindset at the moment, whether you've done the crisis rehearsal, you still have to have that plan B, C, D, and E. Even if you're totally prepared, you've got to do the what if. Debbie, you briefly mentioned it. George, coming back to you real quick on this. not an uncommon thing. You guys are just pulled in a number of different directions. Everybody at one point or another wants a piece of you. You know, whether it's from the judges to the offenders or supervisors or whatever. Not an uncommon thing, you think, to other officers to find themselves in similar situations?
It's not an uncommon thing, and I think that most of the time in our everyday lives, when outside of work, we're not treading so close to the danger zone, to the edge of the cliff, as we are when we're on the job. We have more potential hazards out there when we're on the job than when we're not, at least theoretically. And the more that that circumstances distract you from a focus on safety, the more precarious it becomes for you. I've heard, during the course of David's story, the term focus over and over. He got focus. He got it late. The trick is to get that focus early on, so you prevent yourself from getting in a crisis situation as much as possible.
Okay. Well, let me come back to our audience. That's kind of an inkling of where we're going to go with today's discussion. Let me give you a little bit more of a rundown of how the agenda is going to flow. As I said, we had officers we brought into the building and put them in the studio, put them behind a camera, and peppered them with a few questions. You're going to see those interviews periodically as we roll those tapes. And after each question, we're to come back and discuss the officers' responses and get comments and thoughts, opinions from Debbie and George to each of those questions as well. I encourage you throughout that time, our push-to-talk sites, again, just jump in when you can. If you see an opportunity and there's a question you want to ask, please go ahead and jump in and do that. And start the faxes now. If there are other things that you want to make sure we discuss, start them now. Just keep your faxes. I'll ask you to do this. Keep your questions pretty concise and brief if you can, because the better you do that, the more questions we can actually get on the air. So we're going to go through the questions and hear from our officers. I have come up to a point where I'll have a 10-minute exercise with our push-to-talk sites. I've briefed them a little bit in advance to let them know what's coming down the pike. And then we're going to come back to them after that 10 minutes and hear what they have to say in response to the question we posed to them. From there, we're going back into one more videotaped interview with officers on a question dealing with stress on the job. And then we're going to bring our third panelist in, Dr. Ben Wheat, who's a psychologist from the Bureau of Prisons. And we're going to talk with Dr. Wheat. He's going to join us for our discussion on stress. And then he and I are going to have a little bit more intimate discussion about the topic of suicide with a focus on suicide in the federal probation and pretrial services system. So that's what's in store, and I hope you can stay with us for the entire broadcast. Let's look at our first videotaped interview with our officers. We have a question we posed to them about how dangerous is this job. So let's sit back and listen to what your fellow officers had to say.
I think my job as a pretrial services officer certainly has the potential of being dangerous. We're just meeting them for the first time, and who really is this person? What kind of attitudes or presumptions do they have about what's going to happen? They see me as an ally or an adversary.
The kinds of defendants coming out of custody today are different than even 5 or 10 years ago. A lot of them have served very long sentences. The gangs are always a problem, and they continue to be a problem. But I think that our defendants have become more sophisticated, just like we've become more sophisticated.
This job has a certain amount of danger to it, and I think it's gotten more dangerous over the years. I'd say there are several reasons for that. We are dealing with people with very serious problems, psychosocial, drug, etc. And very often we don't represent something good, at least initially. We're authority figures with the potential of sending someone to jail. And I think we are at risk to have someone take out their frustrations on us.
Is the job inherently dangerous? Yes, I do think so. I think because of the type of clientele we deal with, but also because of the stress level that's associated with the job. I think any job where you spend a majority of your time in communities that there's always the possibility of some type of violence, whether it's against you or you just may be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So you always have to be very conscious of where you're at and basically the type of people you're dealing with.
Okay, that's our first question. That's what our your officers had to say. George, Debbie, let me come back to you now on this. About the dangerousness of the job. Rightfully so. Whenever you talk to somebody about this topic, they're going to have a focus that's external. They're going to be looking at the offenders, at the community, the other issues, the issue, intensive supervision. Seldom do we hear about the internal, potential for internal threat. What is it that the officer, that he or she might bring to the table that could conceivably make that situation more dangerous or even less dangerous? Debbie, let me start with you. Reactions to what your colleague said, but also a little bit about this internal component.
Mark, I think that some of us, when we go out in the field, we might be there physically, but we're not there mentally. And if you're not there mentally, you're very vulnerable. It shows. Some examples would be talking on your cell phone, shuffling papers, being very easily distracted. And George made a good point that when we walk out the door in the morning, we have to make a personal commitment to safety. We have to say, yes, I'm going to be safe today, and for ourselves, for our partners, for our agency, for our lives. And I don't think a lot of people really think about that. We look at the external factors, but inside, we have to make a commitment to ourselves. I think that's very important.
George, about you?
Yeah, the way I look at it is life is inherently dangerous.
Sure.
What all the stressors that we have, all the issues that were brought up by the officers that were interviewed, what that does is raise the stakes. So a frame of mind that, for the most part, is going to get you through without a lesser likelihood of a crisis occurring during your normal life is going to be perhaps insufficient to get you through situations that you encounter on the job, because it raises the stakes. You're living closer to the edge of danger when you're working with offenders in the conditions that we do, in the environments that we do. It raises the stakes. So I believe that in order to be a safe officer, you have to start off being a safe individual, for starters.
Just across life in general.
And have that mindset right across the board. Because you never know when a crisis situation is going to present itself, and the likelihood that it will present itself while on the job is increased by virtue of all the particulars that were outlined by the officers interviewed.
So George, what you're saying is that basically our most important weapon that we have is our mind.
Well, absolutely. It starts with that. And if that's not in gear, by the time you gear up to a crisis situation, it's too late. It happens too fast.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So is there enough, well, the training programs you guys are affiliated with, is there a strong focus on the issue of mindset? Or some people call mindset attitude. We can interchange the terms. Is there a sufficient emphasis on that? I mean, I heard a district say once that I certainly won't identify them, but we don't need a lot of safety training because our people know how to talk to their offenders.
Yeah.
And just get your thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. We do know how to talk to our offenders, but that's not all you need to be able to do. Yeah, all the training I do starts off with mindset. It starts off with a level, what level of commitment do you have to provide for your own safety? Nobody else can do that for you. Nobody else can train you to develop a mindset. It's up to you to secure your own safety, and it starts with a commitment. It starts with figuring out what in your life is significant enough for you to do all the work that it requires in order to be safe. So that's where I start all my training, is to have people conjure up in themselves what external reality will not exist if you're not around. What's important enough to you to do all the work necessary to secure your own safety. Okay. And it's the foundation.
I guess, Mark, I'm fortunate. The district where I work, and that we have a lot of safety training. And it's become a priority. And I also think that the more safety training that you do, even though it's not inherently called mindset, it makes you think. Just like the applied officer safety, real life situations, it makes people stop and think, and that's the information and the feedback that I've gotten back from my fellow officers. So although it's not called mindset, it is
Mark,
a mindset.
a lot of times people aren't motivated to develop a mindset until they are in that crisis situation.
Sure.
If you talk to colleagues, if you talk to people who have been around for a while, every one of them can describe to you a crisis situation that they found themselves in and how that was a wake-up call.
Well, let's use that as a jump-off point. We're going to go now to our next interview, our videotape with the officers, because we get into that a little bit more. It's a good segue. We ask the officers at this point, what type of mindset should you have to be safe on the job? And let's, again, turn to them. Let's hear what they have to say.
For me, what I think is important in thinking about someone's mindset is common sense. I try not to forget common sense.
I carry a certain level of respect in how I deal with the offender in the office, in the field, and I think that translates into, they reciprocate.
I think that what I do when I come to work is I try to focus on work and try to put aside maybe other stressors, which is very easy to say and very hard to do. But I think by staying busy at work, maybe you have a buddy system at work, a coworker that you can team with and go out in partners. That reduces my stress a lot because that's 4 eyes looking to keep the environment safe. Just develop a routine as a new officer of going to a home with a mindset that you're there for business and you're there to be alert, and ask about who's home, ask about animals, travel with a partner so that you're safer. Just kind of try to put your personal thoughts or your personal problems or the test you're going to take at school that night, put that in the back of your mind. When you go to a residence, think about safety, be alert, communicate well with your partner, and focus on that particular stop.
I think there's a tendency for all of us, because we're typically pretty driven in this profession, whether it's pretrial or probation, that we can become task-oriented. Realize that the task is not always the goal. The goal is to remain safe and for me to get home to the things that are the most important to me. And so trying to stay away from those task-oriented philosophy that I think many of us operate under.
With some of the trainings that I've had and some of the experiences that I've had in my life, I sort of see things through, think it out. You know, when I go into any given situation, I try to think about, suppose this individual is not going to be receptive to me. Suppose when I get into the home, there's a dog that wasn't listed in the file, some unseen danger, something that I cannot account for. I try to play out those scenarios while I'm driving into the home, into the neighborhood. If I have the opportunity to go over all of the addresses and people that I want to see on a given day, that day prior to actually making the visits, to sort of think it out, to try to think up negative things and how would you handle them.
Okay. Talked about the mindset officers should have, some of the points that the officers brought up. Common sense, respecting the offender, focusing on work, putting aside personal stressors, developing a routine. Don't become too task-oriented. I want to focus on that a little bit. And the last one from David Hurd was cognitively rehearsing, that crisis rehearsal aspect that we talk so much about in safety training. Debbie, let me come back to you. I want to focus a little bit on this idea of being too task-oriented. It's one of the things that I've heard from folks that are doing a lot of the, maybe the safety academies, the applied officer safety program, scenario training. When they run these, sometimes officers become very focused on the task at hand, whatever it happens to be, to the detriment of their safety. Would you comment or talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Mark. Regarding the Applied Officer Safety Program, 2 things. First of all, most officers are aware that they're going into a safety situation, so they have a heightened sense of awareness. Second of all, I think that the level of force corresponds with the tools that are available, and sometimes, and we are great talkers, what I've noticed is that there's a social worker in all of us to a certain extent, maybe,
Yeah.
and that some people may stay longer to get that task done thinking that they can talk the person out of the situation. And I've seen that in some of the scenarios because we're, you know, we want to help. We want to, we generally want to be able to talk to the person, and we have to get that form signed. So sometimes I've seen people may stay longer than they should. Yes, we are very task-oriented. There's certain things we need to do, and we're all very busy. I think I can speak for all officers. We all have a very busy schedule, and so sometimes we become preoccupied.
You know, you hear, and you mentioned the social work aspect, it just reminds me of the seemingly never-ending discussion of law enforcement versus social work, and it really seems, the pendulum seems to be coming back to, we got to be both. You know, you're never all one or all the other. You really got to mix and match. We talked about the interpersonal skills, George, a little bit earlier. Y'all do have great interpersonal skills. There's no doubt about that. And mixing that or matching that to you know, good safety practices. George, have you seen in your training that this task orientation perhaps becomes something that almost to the detriment of their safety?
Well, yeah, I think because what's lacking is the habit to have safety as an overriding mindset. I mean, even in a scenario situation when officers are called to go through a safety scenario where you would expect that the highest level of awareness that they could muster is in play, I often see it that this task-oriented approach dominates and really keeps people in hazardous situations that they should have been out of long before. And I think what's lacking is just the habit of being in a safe mindset. I think that there is the perception that you can turn it on and off, that you can turn a safety mindset on and off when you perceive a threat. And the point I want to get across is that that's just too late. You have to be in a safe mindset at all times. And what that means is varies depending on the situation. You can't nail it down and say you have to do X, Y, and Z because it's circumstantial.
How do you couple that, though, with you want that safety mindset, but you also are striving officers to get comfortable with what they're doing. You feel good about it, have that confidence level, and they're interacting with offenders and getting that paperwork done, answering to the many demands of the job, and still stay safe.
I think, if I may talk,
Yeah, go ahead, please.
One of the principles of applied officer safety is that there's two basic principles when you go out in the field. The first is that there's an unknown risk or that there's a high risk. And don't assume anything. And I think with the scenarios, and I think sometimes mindset is taught by training, and what the scenarios teach people, yes, we all make mistakes going through scenarios. Not all of us, but some of us make mistakes going through scenarios. But the great part is that the debriefing. I've had a lot of feedback when people talk about the debriefing from scenarios and say that even if they didn't say it out loud at the debriefing that we have in the office, then they'll go home at night and they'll say what if, and they'll look at things to do differently in the future. Perhaps maybe I shouldn't have stayed to get that form signed. So that is success. So even if we see ourselves becoming too task-oriented in one way, it makes us think, and that's what training is all about.
So you're finding scenario training, George, let me ask you the same thing, is a preferable way to help get this issue of mindset across to people?
What scenario training does, one of the main things it does is that it sparks that crisis situation in a safe setting so that people realize what mindset they have or don't have relative to safety, and it gives them a wake-up call in a safe environment. Bottom line is, I think we're all wired to be, with all the radar that we need in order to be able to pick up things that are going to be hazardous to our safety. We just have to pay attention to that wiring. There's a great book, and I'll just mention it briefly, by Gavin DeBecker called The Gift of Fear, that just gets into it in detail. It's just developing the habit of being aware of wiring that's already built into us genetically.
Okay. I was going to ask you a question about training. Well, I will before we go to our exercise with push-to-talk sites. Let me ask this: how do you know through your training that you're getting through to officers with regards to the, this issue of proper mindset or proper attitude towards safety? I know you put them through the scenarios, you debrief afterwards, you're videotaping these things, and they're watching this and thinking, you know, yeah, this is what I did. There's no denying you can't, you know, the camera doesn't lie, so to speak. But how do you know as a trainer that you're getting through, that that concept is becoming embedded?
Real easy, Mark. They tell me.
Yes.
They tell you how kind of
it's
feedback?
real easy. Yeah, it's just
After
you know,
the fact, during the fact, or both?
well,
or?
in the applied officer safety, right after the scenario is run, and you have them watching the videotape of it. Right then, during the general debriefing as well, in defensive tactics in the days and weeks following, how it really made them help them get a new perspective on safety.
If I may, I agree. And probably the best feedback is when your officers come up to you in the hall and they come into the office and they say, now I have a code word with my partner. I never had that before. I learned that. We went out and I actually really talked with my partner before going in another situation. And
the training made an impact, and they're coming to you after the fact and telling you.
Right. So
this
when
is what they've physically changed.
And when they didn't have to give the feedback, and they came up and said it was great training. So.
Good points. Great segue. Jump off point now to our exercise with our push-to-talk sites. You guys know what's coming now. The question for you is, how do you teach mindset in the safety training program? What are you doing at your sites in your particular offices? Is it scenario-based? Are you doing something a little different? Have you added something to what you previously established? Tricks of the trades you're finding is really helping to get this topic of this issue of mindset across to people. So we're going to give you 10 minutes to sort of discuss that at your sites. We're going to come back and I'm going to pick on you. I'm going to go to site. I want to hear what you have to say. So let's take our 10 minutes to do that. The rest of you got a 10-minute break, so we'll see you then. Okay, welcome back. Going to get ready to go to our push-to-talk sites and see what they came up with. Let me just mention real quickly to our sites that if you, in the course of your response, you have some questions you'd like addressed as well, we will make note of those. I'll get through all the sites first, and then we'll come back and address your questions, okay? Let me start with, and go way out west, Phoenix, Arizona. Is my good friend Don Hendricks there? Don? They told me you were there. Okay, let me move down a little south.
Mark?
Yeah?
This is Jerry Brown from Tucson, Arizona.
Okay. Jerry, turn the volume on your TV down a little bit. We're getting feedback over the air.
Okay.
Very good. Jerry, what'd you come up with?
Well, we discussed this. Our group here is primarily probation officers, and I'm the only pretrial services officer. But we discussed scenario-based training, emphasizing that, and including that with defensive tactics training. And then a very good point was brought up, having an expectation of teamwork when doing field work, and using that also, that expectation, carrying that over into actual training in teams.
And by teamwork, is that the partner issue, going out in partners?
I'm sorry, will you repeat that?
When you refer to teamwork, Jerry, are you referring to going out in the field in partners? Is that what you mean by that?
Absolutely.
Okay. We may get a chance to touch on that a little bit later, but thanks for the feedback on that. Let me go north of where we are to New Hampshire, and Kathy Battistelli. Are you guys there?
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Kathy, star of stage.
Mark.
Kathy, I can hear you.
Mark, we came up with a couple of things.
Okay, turn the volume down on your TV.
One was we thought that we should have ongoing training, which we try to do in the district, including a variety of training methods for the entire force continuum.
Okay.
The second was to try to teach individuals informally about incidents that we observed happening to officers in the field and coming back to the office and debriefing those incidents after they happened. And pairing new officers up with more senior officers when they go into the field so they can learn from the older, more experienced officer.
Let me go back to the second point just real quick, Kathy. Highlighting incidents from the field, and then you're coming back and talking about those. Now, are these necessarily things that happen in New Hampshire or just across the country?
No, that happened to our officers here in New Hampshire when they're doing, say, a home contact or going out with other agencies or some incident that could potentially be an officer safety hazard.
And do you have the officers that were directly involved? Are they sort of sharing their story, talking about what happened, and then you debrief from there? Is that the way that unfolds?
Yes, usually they'll come back, and sometimes it's informally and just sort of hear, whoever's in the office that day will hear about it. Other times it comes up in a more formal setting in a staff meeting where we talk about the incident, how it was handled, and maybe what people could have done better.
Good deal, Kat. I really like that technique. It sounds like it's been having some real impact. Let me move along. Thank you for that, and go to Buffalo and Barry Horton.
Hi, Mark. We've come up with a number of things. First one being that we develop what's called a personal bodyguard mentality, where officers are stressed that they're responsible for their own safety. In addition, it's not only on duty but off duty, because many times once we're done working, the people we supervise are in the community, and lots of things can happen when you're out with your family and stuff. So maintaining that bodyguard mentality is going to keep you safe and the ones you care about. The other thing is just we have ongoing training in this district with both firearms, DT, and simunitions training. We try to make it reality-based, which is going to afford officers, if they make those mistakes, that the next time around they'll have a prior memory as to how to respond in the future.
Outstanding. I really like some of those concepts, Barry. Thank you. Let me move down south to our friends in North Carolina. Jeff Neighbor. Jeff, are you there? Okay, let me go to New Jersey. And Art Penny. Art, are you with us? Okay, I'm going to try Delaware. Ellen Krause.
Hi, Mark.
What'd you
Can
guys
you hear me?
Yes, I can. What'd you come up with?
We talked about the fact that training needs to be ongoing, and a lot of it is repetitive of what some of the others said. Discussing scenarios and things that have happened to us. And the other thing that I think is important to point out is that we talk about it, safety in the office as well as in the field, and that hasn't been mentioned too much. Right. I think there are issues in the office that can be as much of a threat to your safety as making visits in the community. We also do a lot of interacting with the U.S. Marshals Service, and especially if we're going to be in arrest situations, we discuss that with them and we make plans for that and we prepare ourselves. And I think a lot of it is what George said, this mindset issue of thinking a scenario through and thinking, what if this should occur? How am I going to respond to it?
Okay. Thanks, Ellen. Good information. Let me just ask real quickly, did Puerto Rico, was Puerto Rico able to get on with us? Doesn't sound like they were. Okay.
Mark, this is Jeff Neighbor in North Carolina.
Well, hi, Jeff. What'd you come up with during the exercise? Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for giving me a minute here. We discussed how crisis rehearsal and having a visual imagery of what we might be confronted with could be important.
Okay, and I know you guys run a safety academy down there.
Yes, we do, and we've used that concept early on when we do the academy, but also periodically with our officers in district.
Okay. We need to move this along. Jeff, thanks so much for coming on board with us. If anybody listening in who was not a push-to-talk site heard some things that they thought were kind of interesting, they'd like to talk further with these sites, give us a call at the center, and we'll give you the information to the contact people at those particular sites, and you can follow up with them. But thank you very much. Good information from the push-to-talk sites on that question. What I want to do now is move along to our next videotaped interview. Go back to our officers. And this time we're going to take a little bit of a focus on the stress of the job. And we ask them what are the stressors that they find are unique to this job. So again, let's sit back and listen to what they had to say.
I think life, your personal life gets in the way. You may come into work fully prepared to be prepared, be safe, be ready. You may get a call from a family member having problems, and that may throw you off. From a judge that needs a report immediately. Coworkers having problems, you start to lose focus.
It's the unknowns of going in, not knowing what it's going to be like if you are going out to see someone, what's waiting for you. You don't know who may be in the apartment with you, and I think that heightens anxiety, or who's going to be in the neighborhood. And it's the unknown. I think that adds the stress.
The stress that I personally feel during the course of my work as a pretrial officer is much more attached to my specialty of electronic monitoring. That job is, without question, a 24/7 job, and whether it's beeper coverage or doing new installations or the supervision of these defendants, your responsibility doesn't start and end with office hours. It's weekdays, weekends, holidays. It really doesn't matter what else is going on.
For me, the stressors I've identified on the job are not always related to the defendants or the offenders, but they're related more to maybe inter-office dynamics, relationships with coworkers, trying to manage administrative tasks while serving as a field officer or a pre-sentence officer or pre-trial, and trying to manage more field work and balance out administrative duties.
With the nature of pretrial work, you don't know when arrests are going to come. You don't know who might get released with the condition of electronic monitoring.
It's being pulled in a lot of different directions. Can create a lot of stress, and then balancing that out also with your personal life and keeping all of it in perspective.
Okay, that was our question on stress. Those are the responses. Some of the things you heard focused on: personal life issues, the unknowns of the job, specialty assignments, electronic monitoring. Deanne Surpass from Louisiana was talking about that. The inter-office dynamics, we heard Connie Smith mention that a little bit. It's a little bit of a different twist in terms of what we typically hear about some of the stressors on the job. Then the spur of the moment nature, rather, of pretrial work, and I think the work in general. And the overall, I think, arching issue of being pulled in multiple directions. Before I go to George and Debbie, let me welcome our third panelist also to the program. Is Dr. Ben Wheat from the Bureau of Prisons. Dr. Wheat's a psychologist, as I mentioned, and is here to join us in the discussion of stress, but also in a little bit, he and I are going to be talking a little bit more about the topic of suicide that I mentioned earlier. So getting into the issue of stress, George, Debbie, let me first turn to you. You heard some of the issues where the folks brought up. Relationship of stress and safety. George, let me start with you. What's been your experience? What have you seen in your real-life settings and even in training settings?
You know, all the factors that were mentioned are certainly legitimate. What I look at them as is static. Static that interferes with your focus on safety. Mm-hmm. And there's been, the concentration has been on stressors, but there's positive, positive things that can serve as static or distractions as well. I mean, if you go out into the street with a lack of focus because your wife just told you that she's pregnant, and now you're all excited and mm-hmm. you're overwhelmed by that reality, or you won the lottery, or there's some other real overriding emotional thing in your life, even if it's a real positive thing, it still serves as static to distract you from a focus on safety, from maintaining that clarity about what's coming up ahead in the moment that you're in.
Debbie, what have you seen?
I agree with my coworkers and the stressors. Excuse me. However, Mark, I think that stressors are very unique to the individual. That's been my perception, and I'm sure what is stressful to me may be not stressful to George or vice versa. And I think that we need to take that into account. Each individual knows what their level of stress is, and they know what situations are more dangerous for them than others, perhaps, and not always necessarily work.
I always find it interesting, the scenario-based training. You try to deliberately build stress into your mm-hmm. scenarios, and officers will come and say they know it's a training setting or whatever, and they don't particularly feel stressful. And if you've got a good real-life mm-hmm. scenario cooking, and they come out of it, they sort of look at you like, mm-hmm. That's a little more stressful than mm-hmm. I was expecting. Ben, let me drag you into this discussion a little bit. Some of the issues that are mentioned, I mean, we can't get rid of the stressors per se. I mean, they're with us all the time in any number of different aspects of our life. These guys have mentioned, several, as well as the officers interviewed. What are some suggestions you would have for folks in this field in terms of managing their response to the stress that they experience?
Oh, it's a great challenge. I tell you, one of the biggest obstacles to having a good mindset can be stress if you don't handle it appropriately. I kind of look at stress from more of a larger perspective and defining it as a balance between demand and resources. And demands are things that are occurring on the job in your personal life, and oftentimes we don't have a lot of control over those. The factors of the job, the stress that goes along with being in law enforcement are there and pretty much all the time, and they're things that you have to adapt to deal with. Where we can have some impact, though, is how we develop our resources to deal with stress. And what I see people get into trouble with most of all is that they get their life out of balance. They get so identified with their work, and they devote so much time and energy to their job that the other aspects of their life become neglected and out of balance. I'm reminded of when I look out my office window here in Washington, we have some beautiful oak trees here in Washington and been there for hundreds of years. They're strong and straight and have beautiful limbs, but if I go out and with a chainsaw and cut off half of those limbs, and I looked at that tree and half of it has heavy limbs and half is barren, over time that tree would begin to lean. That strong, sturdy oak tree would begin to lean. As rains come in the spring, the ground gets soft, the roots become fragile and leans more. Then all it takes is a strong breeze to come along to take that huge oak tree and take it to the ground. Mm-hmm. And it's very similar to our lives. If our lives are out of balance and we don't have a good firm foundation for our life, when things come along, they can blow us over too. They can cause us to have tremendous problems. So that's one factor, I think. The other is the idea that people choose poor coping skills to deal with stress. They resort to some things that are easier to do, like sometimes using alcohol or substances, and things along this line, just kind of relax to escape from it. Whereas there are really good positive ways of dealing with stress: exercise, relaxation, hobbies, things you like to enjoy, things that feel good to you, make you feel better, and take your mind off the work for a while. If we develop those type of resources and that type of balance, I think it can help a lot in overcoming some of the stress factors that we have to deal with at work.
There's been so many stress management classes. I know people can access them all over the place. And I think particularly this last point you're bringing up is that we emphasize this stuff really does work if you do it on a regular basis. And part of what I hear you saying is if we prep ourselves, if we take care of ourselves along the way while things are quote-unquote normal, whatever normal happens to be for us, that when the big one comes around the corner, we're better positioned to deal with it.
Right.
George and Debbie, I'll start with you on this one. Ben briefly alluded to the idea of over-identifying in this job. I certainly saw it in my career in law enforcement where police officers that would socialize with only cops. Mm-hmm. They started really narrowing their social circles after a while, after coming into the job. You see this in probation pretrial services?
With several people, yes. However, I don't think it's really gender-based. I wouldn't say it's more unique to males or females. Mm-hmm. I think it, again, depends on the individual. And I agree with Ben and the balance in life. It's like a mobile. All parts of our life need to be balanced, and if it's too heavily weighed in one area, if something happens, we don't have the balance to appropriately continue on, do what we need to do.
George, let me build on the question a little bit for you. The over-identification issue, I'll ask you to address, but also couple it with what that does to the stress, in your estimation, and subsequently the relationship to safety.
Well, I think the balance analogy that Ben made is excellent. You don't know where the next stressor is going to come from. You don't know where the next strong wind is going to come from. So if you're lacking that platform, that foundation, you're not only more susceptible to get knocked off balance yourself, but you're less effective in what you can do. And it's interesting because that's when we're teaching defensive tactics, the first thing we focus on is balance. Yes. Sure. It's the platform, the foundation for everything else. Yes. So in a physical sense as well as in a psychological sense, it's the beginning.
That's a great analogy with the DT, because if you're not balanced, you can't deliver an effective technique or effective blow at all.
And you're susceptible to getting knocked down more easily yourself because you don't know where the next blow is going to come from.
Great point.
It's an excellent point. You bring that up a lot.
Let me ask the two of you something else, and we're going to move on after this. We've briefly alluded in terms of our discussion of stress about when the big one comes around the corner. And here we are in December on the heels of 9/11 and the attacks at the Pentagon in New York City. Let me ask, in terms of safety, have you seen a change in attitude, mindset with regards to how people in your business are perceiving safety, how maybe they're approaching their job anymore, how they're approaching safety on the job? Has it had an impact in your opinion, in your estimation, Debbie?
Yes, I think it's had an impact in that people are more safety conscious now. I've talked with other officers and individuals in my group, and we do have safety programs in place, and people are asking more questions now. They want to know more about the safety issues, so they're more cognizant of it. They have a heightened sense of awareness, I guess the best way to say that.
And the flip side of that, Mark, is what I've seen is more of an appreciation of the vulnerability that we have, that everything is not always okay. It's okay until it isn't, and you don't know when it isn't going to be.
Yeah.
So what I've seen is really the flip side of what Debbie just said is a heightened sense of how vulnerable we are, which is a good catalyst. It may be the wake-up call that a lot of people need to get roused from complacency.
Okay. Thanks a lot for that input. I appreciate it. It gives us a little bit of a segue into what I'm referring to as our second phase of the broadcast. We've talked a reasonable amount at this point with regards to personal mindset and safety, a little bit about how it influences us throughout the use of force continuum, and now how it affects us from a stress-related standpoint and how stress affects our safety mindset. One of the other things that we're going to be discussing this afternoon, as I've mentioned earlier, is the topic of suicide, and specifically suicide in federal probation pretrial services. And I think it's a good transition point here to move from how stress can affect us just from a safety standpoint and how we try to effectively manage it, as some of the things Ben has mentioned, and now talk a little bit about what happens, what are some of the issues, the whys and wherefores, when maybe that stress can be so overwhelming that suicide does enter into it. So Ben, again, I want to thank you for coming on board to join us for this part of the discussion.
Good to be here.
And let me start with a statistic. In federal probation and pretrial services, since around 1986, there have been 7 suicides in the federal probation pretrial services system, lining that up against 1 line of duty death since that same time period. The 7-to-1 ratio. Now, I'm not getting into any of the nitty-gritty about these incidents. It is a personal, private issue for the families and the districts themselves, and so we're not going there. But looking at the ratio itself, 7-to-1, when you look at other law enforcement agencies and you see a similar suicide to homicide ratio, FBI, LAPD, NYPD, I've looked at the research, and you consistently see a higher suicide rate as opposed to the homicide rate. Give us some thoughts as to why that might be.
Well, you're exactly right, Mark. That rate is consistently higher in law enforcement. And we can look at it again from 2 different approaches. One is more of a generic global perspective that in law enforcement, predominantly and historically, it's been men that have occupied these law enforcement positions. And now, in recent years, we've had a lot more females come on the force and become law enforcement officers. But if you just look at the idea that the majority of all law enforcement officers are the male gender, and then you look at the idea that suicide in itself occurs more often in males than it does in females, you would naturally see that an occupation who is predominantly a male occupation would have more suicides than other occupations who have more of a mixture of male and female. So I think over time, as we have more female officers come aboard and we get more of a balance in our jobs and in our law enforcement, that we'll see some of that drift out, that rate may go down as far as being a higher occupation rate for suicide.
You and I, just on the gender issue real quick, you and I talked earlier about this. You did mention at one point, however, that when females come into these professions, sometimes it tends to wash out because their behavior becomes more like the males in terms of their adaptation, their assimilation to the job.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. In the Bureau of Prisons, we see that we have a pretty good mixture of male and female ratio for law enforcement. And the suicide rate, as far as attempts and this type of stuff, are basically beginning to level out.
Is that right?
So so if we took the ratio of the number of females and number of males, it would be almost an equal ratio of that each gender that's unfortunately choosing suicide as a way of dealing with the problems they're having. The other issue is just a stigma associated with seeking help. And I think in law enforcement, we operate on the context that we are problem solvers and that we control our environment. We have to be in charge of what's going on around us, or we could get physically injured. And so the idea of being in control and being problem solvers makes it difficult to switch over when we have a personal problem, a problem in our personal lives that we're unable to deal with, that we try and we do various things and it doesn't get any better and it actually gets worse. Then the idea of stepping out and letting other people know that we have these problems and even seeking professional help with those problems can be a large obstacle, because in our society there's a stigma sometimes attached to reaching out and getting professional help or help from a colleague when you're having a difficulty. So
sure. There's one thing I want to note on that. I just also need to remind our push-to-talk sites or our viewing sites together to remember to fax questions in. I know they just put the fax number up on the screen, so let me just remind you to do that. Again, if the Spirit moves you to ask. On that note about asking for help, I know it reminds me of something I heard in relationship to this whole topic was we'd be surprised to hear about the incidence of suicide in general, where the mental health professional, this individual was seeking mental health assistance, the number was close by, and they never reached out.
Right.
They never made that phone call, even though help was literally a phone call away.
It's a challenge. It's difficult for people to do, but you know, it's something that is there. It used to be that, you know, medications and various things that were available to assist people who are having mental or emotional problems had such horrendous side effects, and there was a lot of stigma attached to getting the help. But I think now in our society, it's becoming much more acceptable. The medications and the ways that people are being able to have treatment, they can still work on the job. They can still function at home. They can still get the help they need to really help them solve the problem without having to leave work, get leave of absences and things like that. So there's a lot of progress has been made in mental health and how to help people who have issues around that. One of the things, though, if we get more specific about law enforcement, there have been studies done, and actually we've done some work in the Bureau of Prisons to look at the suicides that we've had and try to get an understanding of what were some contributing factors. And these trends continue to pop up in the research, and we saw it also in the Bureau of Prisons. One is the idea of alcoholism and the use of alcohol. I mentioned earlier the idea of appropriate coping with stress. And we have a tendency to do things that are easy because it's hard. You know, we already got enough problems in our life. To fit in an exercise schedule or something like that can be difficult. So it's easier sometimes to go home and have a few drinks that relax us. And I'm not really talking too much about a few drinks every now and then or a few drinks during the week. What I'm talking about is people who have alcohol problems to the point that they impact work. They start having problems at work. They start having problems financially. And what we see more readily is problems with relationships. And just to show this idea of more suicide in law enforcement, in the general population, 10% of the general population are alcoholics. Studies show that in the law enforcement, 23% are alcoholics. So it's almost twice the rate of the general population of people who have real serious problems with alcohol that work in law enforcement. So that can contribute to the idea of more suicides because alcohol is a depressant, and among alcoholics, the rate of suicide is 270 per 100,000. In the general population, is 11 per 100,000. So you can see the tremendous impact that alcohol can have on pushing someone toward a more depressive, more suicidal type of thinking.
Sure.
The other is relationship problems. We see in law enforcement. In the general population, you folks have seen and read where about half the marriages end in divorce, about 50%. Studies show that in law enforcement, 60 to 75% of the marriages end in divorce. Divorce is a very traumatic thing. It can have a serious impact on an individual's ability to focus, have a mindset on the job, deal with stress, and oftentimes relationship problems generate other difficulties involving, you know, money, dealing with divorces and child custody issues and all the issues that surround that. So people turn to alcohol sometimes to help deal with that. So.
Go ahead, George.
Sure. What that says to me is that even if the stressors that lead to alcoholism and then the actual, you know, increase of stresses because of the alcoholism and then the relationship problems that you just mentioned don't lead to the end of the line, which is the suicide, you have a compromised individual out there dealing with the same risks, working on the, closer to the edge of danger because of the nature of our job that we've already discussed is more hazardous than most. You have a compromised individual trying to remain safe in a dangerous environment. So I think all the more it behooves us as a system to really focus on mindset that is safety and to develop the habits that are going to get us through day to day safely. So I think it's just all the more important because of the stats that you just mentioned.
You're exactly right, George. And you also make a good point about the idea that moving from perhaps a drinking problem and a difficult issue around a relationship to suicide is a pretty big leap. And many of us have gone through divorces and or had problems with drinking, but we haven't contemplated nor taken our own life. I think what we see, though, is the issue that moves it further toward that suicide spectrum is the idea that depression begins to set in. And depression is a serious mental issue. And 15% of the people who get depression end up committing suicide. It's very common in our society. Many people don't realize how many people suffer from depression. And if it goes untreated, it can be very devastating. And then you couple that with an idea of hopelessness associated with the idea that depression narrows your focus on choosing options of how to get yourself out of the situation. And the next step is to become hopeless. And if you're living in that kind of lifestyle, the option that you pick is to take your own life to get out of that pain that you're in.
Let me jump in here. We've got a question I've been told from one of our Push to Talk sites. Who do we have, and what's your question? Okay. There might be a technical problem with putting him into the studio at this point. Whoever the site is, if you've got a question and you want to try and fax it in quickly to us, we're experiencing a problem. I apologize for that. Ben, let me come back to ask you about, we've had supervisors watching, and we've had a couple of managers that have submitted some questions in advance. What do you see as the role that managers can do to help an employee, be they officer or staff, when you're dealing with this concern of suicide, and sort of coupling that with a question that we had regarding the stress-related issues? When's the right time for supervisors to refer staff to counseling for help in dealing with on-the-job stressors that may become dangerous?
It is really a difficult decision for supervisors to make, of when to basically begin to ask questions about a person in a personal way. You know, it's easier for us to focus on performance and conduct and that type of thing, but when we believe that those problems that are occurring at work have really a root cause being in something in their personal life, it's very difficult to do. So, but really, it is a very important role, because many people want to know that their supervisor cares about them. They want to know that they've noticed that their job performance has declined, or that they're having problems with absenteeism, or that their attitude has changed, or that they're doing things that would get them hurt on the job. Their mindset isn't there anymore. And a good supervisor would want to protect their staff, and they would step in and say, you know, we're concerned that you're going to be okay out there making your home visits and things like this. So one, I think, is to be aware, be cognizant of the fact that your staff are changing. There's something happened in that individual's makeup and how they're doing their job that's different than they used to be. But everybody has a bad day, and people can get physically ill and have a couple of bad days, and they may even be going to the hospital, and it could be something totally physical that's causing the problem. So what I recommend to supervisors is, if you have a staff member who is beginning to show some patterns of difficulty that you can't put your hand on as to what's causing it, if it doesn't start to improve after a week and a half or so, give people a couple of days to work through personal issues that just hit them, and they'll recover from it usually in 3 or 4 days. But if they're not, if you see it continuing on, there's a time to pull them in private and confidential, and let them know you care. Let them know that you're interested in their life and how things are going. And what I recommend to do is they start from a physical perspective, because going right to the mental health issues can be uncomfortable. So I ask them, you know, recommend they talk about, are you feeling okay? Is there anything wrong with your health? Have you been getting enough sleep? Are you resting? Because I've noticed these changes in you. And oftentimes people will move into the direction of talking about their problems in their life, and that will give the supervisor an opportunity to recommend EAP, counseling services for them. I don't think we should put our supervisors in a role of trying to resolve the problems for the staff member, or to be a psychologist or a mental health person, but basically to let them know they care and that there are resources available for them. So, because oftentimes staff members don't realize what options they have with EAP and their health insurance and various other ways that they can get help.
Okay. What about some signs and signals that officers and staff could use if they to look for that there are some? You've mentioned a few of the biggies: the alcohol issue, substance abuse, and the relationship issues. But what are some of the other signs and signals that folks might want to focus in on?
Well, there's one that we often hear that's really a myth about suicide, and that is that if a person talks about suicide, they won't actually do it. In reality, that myth is the opposite. People who are contemplating suicide will be ambivalent at times about whether they want to take their own life or not. I mean, life is precious to us, and to make that decision to take your own life for most people is not an impulsive act. It's something they've thought about. And in that process of trying to make that decision, they'll often confide in a close friend or a colleague that they wish they wouldn't wake up tomorrow, or life would be better if they were gone, their family would be better off without them. I don't know how much longer I can stay here with to the problems I've got. I just wish I could go away and never come back. Those are, kind of vague indications that person may be contemplating suicide. So what my first recommendation is, if you know of a person is seeing a pattern here that we're having some difficulty in their life, and then they start making those kind of statements, don't be afraid to take them aside and talk to them about the idea that they may be contemplating taking their own life. Many people I've dealt with that have been suicidal at one time will reflect back at that personal friend or their supervisor who set them aside and said, hey, I care about you, and I don't want you to do something here that I could lose you as a friend or a colleague, so what can we do to help? And they really do respond and come out of it. So one is, don't be afraid to talk to somebody about it, and when you see those statements being made. The other things you'll see is people will lose interest in things they like to do. They have hobbies and things that they like to engage in. Suddenly they don't have any interest in that nor energy to do it. You'll notice that they'll move themselves away from friends and family and pull themselves back. They may have a tendency to start preparing for their death, literally, locating where they would be buried, getting funeral arrangements made. Many people have wills, but if in this context of a problem employee, suddenly they go develop a will, or they begin to make notations as where they want their personal belongings to go to somebody, some family heirloom that they care about, get their finances in order, get a weapon or whatever they're going to need or do to use to kill themselves, write notes about ending their life. Those things you can look at home if you have in your personal life and colleagues at work, you see them start making those kind of plans in the context of somebody that's having an emotional problem, or you can see that they're not doing well in their life. Those are things you should be looking for.
Let me jump into this briefly and go, George and Debbie, let me ask you this. It just occurred to me listening to some things Ben's talking about. I know a lot of probation pretrial services officers over the years that I've worked and talked with them. I've talked about offenders that have gotten and defendants that have gotten suicidal, and they've been alert to their issues and they're paying attention, and I think pick up on some of the things that Ben's talking about. Are we slower to pick up on those in our own, within our own population? Do we tend to turn a blind eye or minimize, do you think?
That's an excellent point, Mark, and while Ben was speaking, I was thinking of the same thing. We framed this in the context of supervisors being aware, but I think coworkers are equally, if not more, attuned with what's going on with individual officers. Yes, I think we have a defined responsibility to be aware of suicidal issues with our offenders. We don't have such a defined responsibility relative to coworkers. But I think it really is important for us to be sensitive to that and to not be afraid to speak up. And what I was going to ask Ben is if you could give us some ideas of how do you go about approaching somebody that you feel is at risk?
That's a good question, George. What I recommend is that you start out with this idea there may be something medically wrong with them. People will have a lot more of a tendency to go see a medical doctor than they will to go see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And oftentimes, the problem that may be generating the depressive behavior in them could be physical. There are things that happen to our bodies that cause us to become depressed, and you really need to rule that out. And oftentimes they can go to their doctor, have a physical, have a checkup, and the doctor can give them advice on what they can do if they suspect they may be depressed, they could get help through that way. But the safest way is to say, have you had a checkup lately? Have you been to the doctor? There could be something wrong. You could be developing some type of illness that is having this impact on you. Would you do me a favor and go to the doctor and have that checked out? Let me know what you find out. And that is a real good way to get them in touch with a professional that's trained to identify people who are depressed and maybe even having suicidal thoughts.
I like that approach. I think more people would feel comfortable with that, because I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable talking with someone concerning their emotion. And if you walk in with that, I like that a lot.
Yeah. And most psychologists and counselors will refer someone to a medical doctor very early in the treatment process because they want to rule out if there's some kind of physical problem that could be contributing to this. Because certainly what we would not want to do is be treating them for an emotional problem when in reality they have an illness that's causing this difficulty.
What about the myth, sort of jumping on the heels of what George and Debbie just mentioned and some of the things you've talked about, bringing up, and when you're approaching somebody, you're concerned, people say, I don't want to ask them if they're thinking about killing themselves because I don't want to plant that seed.
Exactly. I just want to tell the audience that in all my years of working with people who have been suicidal or developed suicidal tendencies, and in working with people through EAP and other components, there is no way that you can bring up the issue of suicide and plant that seed that would generate in them, oh man, I hadn't thought about killing myself. That's one way I could do that.
Thanks very much.
So I think I'll go out and do that. It just doesn't happen. Suicide is such a complex and such a devastating decision that talking about it with someone is not going to be the factor that drives them into that process to say, oh, okay, well, now they've realized that I'm having a problem, I think I'll go kill myself. That has been thought out long before then. There's a lot of things that go into that, and certainly nobody should be fearful of talking to a friend, loved one, colleague about the idea that you're thinking they may be suicidal, because you're not going to be the one that's going to push them over the edge. It just doesn't work that way.
Okay. I don't know, George and Debbie, I'm going to take this a little bit. Do you have any other things you want to put for Ben or question? Okay. And we got a couple of faxes in, but they're going back to some of the things we previously talked about. So what we'll do is address the questions you've sent in and get one of our folks here to get back to the individuals that are asking the questions and give them an opportunity to talk about what some of the responses might be. So again, please don't think we're ignoring. We're just trying to, keep in terms of the format that we've set up here. But thanks a lot for getting those faxes into us. Ben, we're getting ready to close this out, and I'm going to throw a little curve to you, but I think you can give it a little bit of a response here. Going back to 9/11, I know in having done a lot of work in critical incident stress, that in the aftermath of trauma, suicide rates can increase.
They can, yes.
Some thoughts, reactions, suggestions you might offer to our officers out there and staff, and particularly the ones that were directly impacted by the events of 9/11, in terms of just being mindful of that and things to watch out for, things they could potentially do, since we're all trying to manage this?
Well, first off, the idea that the degree to which an individual was involved in the 911 incident, if you were dispatched there, if you were sent there, deployed there to do work, if you had, if you were on the scene, near the scene, if you had close friends or relatives that were involved, the closer you are to the actual traumatic event, the more of an impact it can have on you. So for those in the audience that have had firsthand experience with that traumatic event, and you haven't received any type of debriefing or counseling afterwards, I would encourage you to do that. Statistics show and research shows that strong, very psychologically sound people who get exposed to highly traumatic scenes or events can have an impact on them emotionally that can all be dealt with much quicker if they go and talk with somebody about it in confidence. I mean, oftentimes we don't take that home because we don't want to frighten their families and this kind of stuff. So that's one thing, is if you feel like you've been close to it, do it quickly. The other thing is just to be aware that poor coping mechanisms can take over at this time, drinking, things like that. You get away from the good habits that you've had, and to keep that in mind, to get rest, avoid excessive use of alcohol, stay close to your family, do things you like to do, and get help if you need it.
Ben, thank you so much. I'm going to have to stop you there. I could talk with you forever about it. George and Debbie, thank you so much for giving of your time and talents for the broadcast. Thanks to everyone on the Push to Talk sites and everyone viewing. I hope you got something out of it. I think the time was spent wisely this afternoon. So with that, we have a final videotape with our interview officers and a question that we posed to them about final messages that they would like to send to their colleagues about personal safety, stress, and mindset. So with that, let's listen to what they have to say and enjoy the rest of your day.
I am very much for personal or defensive tactics for personal safety. I believe that firearms for personal safety is a very good idea, but I believe that your mind is the #1 safety mechanism that you have to prevent you from getting into a situation. I would much rather avoid being in a situation that's dangerous, having thought things out and observed my surroundings, than going into a dangerous situation and counting on my ability to use defensive tactics or to use a firearm. Because I think the odds are much higher of survival if you are not in a dangerous situation than if you are in a dangerous situation and having to use some kind of a defensive maneuver.
Don't fool yourself into thinking that you can be safe if you're not dealing adequately with stress and if you're not keeping the safety issue first and foremost in your mind.
I would say definitely be willing to learn. Realize that no matter how many situations or encounters you've ever had in your life, that there's always something else to learn. Be willing to learn, be willing to share that which you learn, because you'll be able to help other people with the information that you've obtained, and information is power, it's freedom. And to believe in something higher than yourself. Have self-confidence, because confidence shows.
Lead a balanced, healthy life. Love your wife, your kids, your significant others, your dog. Have a hobby, have fun, and don't let this job take over the perspective of your whole life. You are more than a probation officer. You have a lot of other roles, and you want to be alive to fulfill them.
This is a job where you have to be honest with who you are. You have to know what your limits are, what your values are, what your attitudes and opinions are about the job, the clientele you serve, the communities you serve.
Don't treat any contact like it's routine, that you've been there before, there won't be any problem. Have a heightened sense of awareness anytime you're in the field. I would say mental preparedness, play through what ifs, what could happen, how you would react to those. And most importantly, go with instinct. You feel something's going wrong, get out safely, and that is the most important. Don't be so task-oriented. You need that monthly supervision report. That's what you set out to do. But think of your safety first.
Stay fit, work smart, practice enhanced supervision so you prioritize your work, and go home safely. Because in the end, we all want to go home safely.